Afternoon. I'm Brett Johnson with the Northwestern University Transportation Center, and I would like to welcome you to the April 2022 Hagestad Sandhouse Rail Group presentation, Ukraine's Railway War. If you can't send ammunition, give them a ride. I'd like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded, that we're only going to record the panelists. And when we get to the question and answer section, I invite you all to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window, and I will take the lead on transmitting the questions to our speaker. So with that, Norm, I'd like to hand it over to you to introduce Henry Posner III.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you all who are attending. I think this is going to be one of the most noteworthy programs that we've had at the Sandhouse. It's almost 30 years ago, or 25 years ago, that the Pittsburgh office of Arthur Anderson called and introduced me to Henry and his company, his father's holding company, and the chief financial officer there at the time, Fred Schwartz. And that has turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful day in my life. And I became the audit partner on the Iowa Interstate, where we had some very interesting situations. And over time, Henry has become a very, very good friend. The thing that I want to point out here about Henry the person is his concern for humanity, which is evident in his biography. And when I first heard about these refugee trains, my comment to my colleagues around a number of places, including the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, where Henry has now become involved in that institution as well, that Henry was being Henry. And I love his story about when he was on the train, even though he was the president of the railroad, that the master conductor was in charge of the train and Henry reported to the master conductor as long as that train was in operation. So Henry the person is someone I really, really respect and appreciate what he has done for the many causes that he has been involved in. And without further ado, Henry, please tell us about what's happening in the Ukraine and how you are helping in that effort.
Okay, well, Brett, Norm, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. The plan is I'll present for about 25 minutes. And yes, I have a PowerPoint, but I think the most important part of the presentation is going to be the Q&A, because you never know what's on people's minds. And more to the point, the situation on the ground changes from day to day. So the other thing I will try to be very careful of is that this is, as this is recorded, I'll try to keep this in mind for the people who are watching later on. So what I wanted to do in putting this presentation together was come up with something which was both topical and would not duplicate what many of you have already seen. And so if you don't immediately recognize the quote about Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, saying, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, consider what it's like to be somebody in the USA wondering what you can do, hence the title. And I would also like to focus on the fact that this is a railway war in the 21st century. Not many times that railways have been so closely tied with any conflict in this century, and so it is worthy of special note. So finally, in some cases, I'm going to refer to our website, rrdc.com, which we populate with news items regarding many things, including our refugee trains. But let's start with the cover photo, which is a photo of the refugee train on the day that I wrote it, which was March 12th, the third day of operation. And what I will do is give you basically an agenda. And again, we're fairly going to blast through this, but give you some background on our business in Germany, focus on the Ukrainian Railway, and then step back and provide some perspective on what might happen in Ukraine, especially as the country is rebuilt after the conflict, and what form that might take. And I would argue that we are uniquely positioned as a company to talk about this because we have been there and done that in other places like Mozambique, where there were conflicts way before we got there. So RDC is not a household name, but for many in the industry who recognize us as a family-owned company, multi-generational, based on partnerships, and that is reflected in the number of companies that we are involved in around the world, as well as the companies we've been involved in the past. And so here are the main names of our current businesses, all of which involve partnerships. But first and foremost, starts with safety, and that drives everything. So our goal is to be the most respected company in our respective markets. But let's focus specifically on Germany, where we were able to organize the refugee trains basically on 4 days' notice. Yes, we thought there might be a need, but the fact is that we got the notice to proceed on a Sunday, and we ran the first train on a Thursday. And a couple topics here, some of which are relevant to the USA. Our company in Germany, it's basically, the company was doing this as a charter train company, meaning that we own our rolling stock and there are crews, but we're running on the national infrastructure, specifically DB Netz, the National Rail Infrastructure Company in Germany. And when we're operating in other countries like Austria, we run on the state railway infrastructure companies there. You'll note that I say this would be impossible in the USA, and I say that not just because in Europe you have a single national operator with all kinds of access options for anybody who wants to come on the network, but there are significant structural differences between Europe and North America. So many that will be a different Sandhouse presentation. So all I will do is mention it. And for those who think that refugee trains are something that we might need in the USA, I think there are a lot of compelling arguments as to why what we are doing in Germany is impossible in this country. And finally, for those who have talked about how courageous I am, please remember, Germany is 2 countries away from Ukraine. And as Norm pointed out, on this particular day that I wrote, I was a member of the crew. Some of the interesting things which I'll share with you are the graph on the upper left that shows the ridership, which shows that after the initial flow of people, everybody who's going to flee, for the most part, fled, and it's bottomed out. And I've been told recently that there are more people returning to Ukraine than leaving. Now that can change, day by day, but in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see the network of connections that was put together in order to facilitate the flow of refugees. And you'll notice that it's basically concentrating people on corridors, basically from the German border, 2 points in Germany, or in some cases from points beyond Germany. But the point here is that Germany is well organized to handle refugees. And so what the government put together was a network of transportation connections, as well as a resettlement center in Hanover, in the center of the country, from where you could go wherever you needed to go. Yes, in many cases, people came with specific destinations in mind, but they were able to travel from Hanover there on the regular network. The main thing was to get people from the border to Hanover for 2 reasons. One, to make it manageable, and second, to take a lot of the pressure off of Berlin, which was where a lot of people wanted to go. One of the things that really helped us in this particular case is we got support from Geiger College, which is a a Jewish educational institution in Berlin, founded by Walter Jacob, or the rabbi of our synagogue here in Pittsburgh, Rodef Shalom. And Geiger's job is to repopulate Europe with, among other things, rabbis. And so a single contact with Geiger produced basically a roster of Ukrainian and Russian speakers who were able to join us on the trains 2 days after the request. A remarkable institution. They've been extraordinarily helpful. And you see in the lower left-hand corner a photo of Alex Kovtun, a rabbinic candidate. He organized the whole thing. So the opportunity to do this is an interesting backstory. Had it not been for COVID, our charter drain business might have still existed. And had it not been for COVID, our single biggest operation, which is to run trains for FlexTrain, who is a bus operator who is entering into the train market now in Europe. And by the way, they're in the bus market in the USA as well. We built that market for them. And when COVID came along, it had two impacts. One, it ended our charter business. But two, it was a test of character for our partnership with FlexTrain. It was a test of character that they failed. And so the relationship ended early in the COVID era. Just as another interesting topic for future discussion, this is sort of a business like Amtrak's charter business, which they ended a number of years ago because they decided it was very difficult to manage. But let's just go back one moment here. And let me also say, today is the last day that we're operating these trains. We got the word a couple days ago that because of the low ridership, that it was no longer necessary to run the refugee trains. So we've stepped back from that, and we'll see what the situation evolves as. But we're very proud of the fact that we were able to put this operation together on short notice, and hopefully it's mission accomplished, though you never know. So let's go to Ukraine. And for this audience, I'm guessing that most of you have already seen some of the fabulous videos and press coverage of how the Ukrainian Railway, Ukrzaliznytsia, call it UZ, is functioning in the war environment. And so looking for one graphic, which I think tells you the story, this is the network of UZ, and the red parts are the part that are in the middle of conflict that are not operating. The green parts are the part that are operating. The railway is truly functioning as the lifeline of the nation. I can't think of any country in which railways have evolved into such an important part of a national struggle as what's going on currently in Ukraine, at least going back to World War II. The historians among us may take issue with that, but this is truly a railway war. And if you look at a lot of the stuff coming from Ukraine, it's all about courage and the determination of the railway workers standing side by side with the military to not only move the nation, but protect the nation. They have done a superb job of communicating this, which is why I think I don't need to tell that story again, because most of you have seen this in multiple forms. If not, there's plenty of fabulous stuff out there. But hold the thought that the railway workers stand side by side with the military in a conflict like this. And let's look at the first time I went to Ukraine, which is in 1999. And of course, me being me, one of the things I went to see was a hump yard in central Ukraine in Zhmyrinka, not far from Vinica, our ultimate destination. And so I was able to visit the Hump Tower. And again, this is 1999. And the only thing I'll say about that is that when I met the terminal superintendent, his vehicle was a dump truck because it was the only vehicle that was operable. So this is not that long after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Ukraine was still finding its way. Other interesting things that happened, and most of the travel to Ukraine was in conjunction with projects that my family has been involved in with the Jewish community there since 1999, is I believe I was on the only police escort of a trolley bus in world transit history. So between Yalta and Simferopol in the Crimean Peninsula, couldn't build a railway, so they built a trolley bus line. And so me being me, I of course needed to ride this trolley bus, and there were some security issues involved. And so the compromise was the only police escort of a trolley bus in world transit history. And again, if anybody knows differently, please contact me afterwards. I would stand well to be corrected. And in 2008, I was on a steam tour of Ukraine. So if you look over my shoulder right here, you see the hammer and the sickle from the locomotive on this trip. There were 100 people on the train. I was the only Russian speaker. And that's how I wound up with the hammer and sickle. And it was not until recently that I appreciated the significance of having that artifact in my personal collection. So my most recent trip of interest to Ukraine was in 2013 when I was in Crimea and did some riding of local trains, for example, from Yevpatoria to Simferopol. And several months after that was when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea. So let's talk about the Soviet legacy, which I think is a very important consideration, because the Soviet legacy is critical to understanding the unique role of railways in the former Soviet Union. And the underlying theme of railway design and operation was a combination of resiliency and standardization. Why do I say that? Because there's always the specter of conflict in mind. And so what you see are a number of views, some from Ukraine and some from Estonia. And I will challenge any of you to tell which is which in terms of the two views from the Hump Tower in the two respective yards. One of them was in Shmerinka in Ukraine, the other one is Muga in Estonia. But even the angle of the windows is the same. And if you look out the window, it's the same locomotive, a CHME or a Czechoslovakian switching locomotive, diesel electric, very, very standardized. So why is this important? Railways in the former Soviet Union were designed to function in times of conflict. And had I had more time to prepare for this, and I'd like to thank the Center for Railway Photography and Art for their support in providing me with a lot of these images from my archive. There are photos that I took of replacement bridges, which were located one mushroom cloud away from where the actual bridge was, specifically waiting for the time that that bridge might need to be replaced in the event of a conflict with, for example, the USA. So resiliency is a word which we hear more of in the USA in view of climate change. But in the context of the former Soviet Union, resiliency is important in the context of conflict. And again, locomotives, same type of locomotive basically everywhere in the former Soviet Union. We find that CHMEs in Siberia, in Uzbekistan, Estonia, every corner of the former Soviet Union. But there is another legacy of Soviet times, which is corruption. And it's not responsible to have a discussion about the former Soviet Union with mentioning corruption. And so if you go to, for example, Transparency International and look at the corruption rankings, Russia and Ukraine are pretty close together on that scale. And I want to include this in the discussion because I want to talk about the future. But before I talk about the future, let's go into the past and talk about our experience in another former Soviet country, Estonia, as well as our experience in a post-conflict country, Mozambique. And I'm going to talk about Estonia in terms of governance and Mozambique in terms of the aid industry. And yes, there is an aid industry. So in Estonia, we were a joint venture partner with, among other folks, Ed Burkhardt's company, Railworld, Ganiger, an Estonian company, and also the Emerging Europe Infrastructure Fund, and the government. So it was the only Soviet railway which is privatized. If you look at the map of Estonia, it looks impressive, but it's basically a really, really big port railway company because most of the business is exports from Russia and other former Soviet countries to the ocean. And if you look at what we accomplished there, we were there from 2001 until 2007. And it was not easy to come up with these statistics on short notice, so I apologize for that. But what we did in a nutshell was maintain the country's competitive position in an extremely competitive market, while at the same time reducing the injuries, which is the bar chart on the right, by 75%. Very proud of that one. And if you look at the timeline of what happened when we were Estonia, 1991, the USSR breaks up. The railway was privatized in 2001. And then it joined the EU in 2004. And we ultimately sold the company back to the Estonian people in January of 2007. And we left Estonia with the sole exception of leaving behind a nonprofit organization, the Estonian Railway Culture Foundation, which supported, among other things, Operation Lifesaver Estonia, which is a very important organization which survives to this day, as well as supporting railway preservation, railway employees, etc. So here is the backstory on the privatization of the Estonian Railway. And you'll note that it starts with accession to the EU. So it's kind of counterintuitive that accession to the EU would increase corruption. But I would argue that it's perfectly explainable in that when you have wealth, i.e. Oil traffic and regulation, it gives you the opportunity to layer in more regulation if the motivation is corruption. And so what happened was the Estonian government basically changed the deal, changed the regulatory environment, and we took the country to arbitration. They were going to lose, and so we settled in January of 2007. And so we exited Estonia, having been there from 2001 to 2007. So 5 months later, the railway lost half of its traffic due to a political dispute with Russia. So the argument against us was that we were a monopoly and that the previous government had acted against the interests of the Estonian people by privatizing it. But if you are a monopoly, then how is it possible that you could lose 50% of your traffic overnight? So there was some political advertisements, and at least gave us the opportunity to employ our sense of humor and irony, which are always important in situations like this. So this was the center party's view of renationalization. And then somebody in the Estonian press came up with this one. We brought the Estonian Socialist Republic back. You can read faster than I can, so I'll just flip through these. But here are some of our internal caption contest winners. So that was Estonia. And again, a European country that became more corrupt by joining the EU. Let's go to Mozambique, where there was a civil war before we got there. And this is a really interesting railway in that it was the lifeline to a landlocked country, Malawi, and it was privatization of not just a railway, but a port. And our role there was both as the shareholder and the operator. What was interesting about Mozambique was the role of the aid industry. And while we would like to think that the privatization of the railway kept it open and allowed it to survive into the era where we could be bought out by local interests who are fronting for Brazilians, who are fronting for Chinese, and still make some money. One of the biggest obstacles to the privatization of the railway was the aid industry. And again, I use the words aid industry. Organizations like USAID, where you had people whose livelihood depended on the railway being dependent on aid, were somewhat threatened by the prospect of the railway being in private hands. And so this particular photo is of a Soviet Railways container with some locomotives in the background, and gives you an example of some of the irony that we came across. The aid industry is well described in the book Lords of Poverty, which I will refer to later. But the point is that there is an aid industry out there, and that in some cases, it makes things worse as opposed to better, especially if there are structural options which might have better outcomes for the country. I would also mention that as you go around the world, typically you come across multilaterals like the World Bank that fund railways all around the world. In this particular case, however, we were able to get funding from a US entity, OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which actually helped a lot. And we're very appreciative to the folks from OPIC. And since this is a photo of a Soviet Railways container in Mozambique, I would have to add that with the passage of time, various countries have stepped into that role. Back then, it was the USSR, and these days it's China. Here is the result of aid programs. I call this the roster shots of shame. I have almost a dozen photos of different locomotives in various cases involved in collisions, derailment, et cetera. But the point is, this is the result in part of the work of aid agencies. You give them stuff, they don't respect it, it's destroyed. I could put a calendar together of nothing but destroyed locomotives from Mozambique. And this is why I call it the roster shots of shame. So let's look forward and let's focus on the most important thing that I'd like to talk to you about today, which is the future, and in particular, rebuilding Ukraine. After the conflict, what happens to the country? Focus on two things, which I've already discussed, the aid industry and governance. Governance is going to be critical for a long list of reasons, not the least of which is in Ukraine, railways both occupy a critical position, as the conflict currently demonstrates, but also is a substantial, big business. And so for both of those reasons, I think it'll be important to focus on the governance of the company in its future. At the same time, the natural tendency will be we will flood Ukraine with aid money, which is why I encourage people to at least read synopsis of the book Lords of Poverty, which I think is the best book on how the aid industry functions. So take these two themes together, which are governance and the aid industry. And it's kind of like the recipe that happened in Estonia, where you have wealth and regulation. Sometimes there are unintended consequences. And what I would simply ask is that people think about what the future might look like. And so I would like to make a modest proposal to this group, which is, given that there is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, that the USA come up with something like the Belt and Suspenders Initiative, which would be a combination of aid and governance. And also, and this is something that I just thought of earlier in the day, and I don't like to go back and edit PowerPoints too close before deadline. Think about the unintended consequences of population loss and what happens if all the people who have fled Ukraine don't go back. And while there is the natural tendency to say, let's employ them, let's have them come to the USA, let's have them come to Europe, et cetera, what if all the people with skills were gone? What does that mean for the country? And so it's important to think about the unintended consequences. And finally, I would like to make a prediction, which is that the role of the Ukrainian railway workers will stand side by side with that of the French resistance during World War II. And in that regard, I commend you to some of the better stuff that's come from France from back then. There's a great film, The Battle of the Rail, La Bataille du Rail. And to this day, French railway workers occupy a unique place in French society. My prediction is that Ukrainian railway workers will do the same. So Slava Ukrainia, glory to Ukraine, but also Slava Geroyam, glory to the heroes. And the railway workers are among the heroes of this conflict. So before we go to the Q&A, let me just thank three entities here. First, Center for Railway Photography and Art. Norm Carlson is a director of it and helped a lot with the research that it took to pull some of these photos out of my archive. Second, thanks to Geiger College for providing the translators on 2 days' notice, an incredible organization, and appropriately ironic thanks to Flixbus for showing us their character so early in the game. Our business is based on partnerships, and that was a partnership was doomed to fail. So with that, I will go to Q&A, and I will stop screen share and take questions and answers.
Well, let's start with a Q&A. I'm going to start with a question from John Plant, who asks, I have read that a bottleneck for the Russians as they attacked westward in World War II was having to transload because of the difference in gauge. Did the Soviets regauge, or did they extend their gauge into the satellite countries post-war? And is there any residual effect on operations in and out of Ukraine?
Right. Excellent question. I think that the break of gauge is one of the things that really helped during World War II, because it certainly advanced. The advance of the Germans was greatly slowed down by the break of gauge. Ukraine has always been broad gauge. Ukraine has always been part of the Soviet network. What you're seeing now, I believe, is that as ports on the Black Sea are closed or under attack, people are trying to route traffic into places like Poland, which involves a break of gauge. And over the weekend, there was a temporary embargo placed on traffic. I'm sure they'll work that off. But the point is, and one of the things that I could not find is a traffic density map of UZ, but I'm guessing what it would show is most of the traffic, just like in the USA, by the way, would flow to the nearest body of water because that's the natural flow of traffic. Additionally, the break of gauge with Poland and other countries inhibits traffic. So what I would guess is that a traffic density map would show an artificially low amount of trans-border traffic simply due to the break of gauge. Typically, in Soviet practice, you can load the cars heavier, and so it's not easy to match up freight car types. So I think that answers the question. If not, could somebody please ask that in a different way?
Henry, I'm going to combine two questions, follow up from John and also from Justin Zubrod. Justin asks, are the rails being used in delivering arms weapons from Poland into Ukraine? If so, how is it handled? Who runs it? And John had followed on to his initial question is, how have the rails survived? And this could apply to all within the country.
Yeah, what I believe is going on is that there's a lot of transshipment at the border. For example, at the Polish-Ukrainian frontier, where you've got the break of gauge, you have some stuff arriving by rail, some stuff arriving by truck. It's being loaded into boxcars or other car types and shipped into Ukraine. As far as the implied in the question was how easy it is to sabotage or destroy railway lines. If you look at the map, there are a lot of detour routes. And again, that takes us back to the Soviet theme of redundancy. But it's not that hard to fix a railway line. And there are railway brigades in the Soviet tradition whose full-time job is standing by in case of destruction of railway lines. So I would guess that it's probably easier to fix a railway line than to fix a highway, simply because they're organized to do that, because they have never lost the capability of preparing for the next conflict.
Thank you, Henry. Arnold Kasimsarn asks, U.S. operators often require extensive training on track conditions and signaling and radio operations before they're allowed to run trains on any tracks. How did the RDC crews get trained to work on and coordinate with Ukrainian controllers in a few days?
We did not operate in Ukraine. The closest we got was the Polish-German border. But that being said, pretty much throughout Europe, you've got the same set of operating rules. And as long as you have experience in running on a particular route, it's not like you have to spend 6 months getting qualified. There is a single set of operating rules. There is a standardized set of things you can expect as far as infrastructure goes. And so it's much simpler than the USA, where you have 600 privately owned railway companies, each theoretically with their own slightly different operating conditions, operating rules, et cetera. It's a lot simpler in a European environment and a post-Soviet environment.
Thank you, Henry. I thought you'd indicated that you weren't operating in Ukraine, but I asked the question as is just to make sure we hadn't missed anything.
Yeah.
Richard Gill asks, how is the refugee train operation financed?
By the government. We are paid to run the trains. How we run the trains is our own style. And we'd like to think that we ran, because at this point, I think our last refugee train is on the move. Do it our own unique way, which is we have Ukrainian speakers on the train. We welcome them in their own language. We welcome them to Germany, and we respect their culture. I don't know of any other company which has gone to that extreme, and I believe that's reflected in some of the thanks that we've gotten from our passengers.
A follow-on from Richard is there anything about the pre-invasion governance of Ukraine's railways to indicate the railways would be poorly governed with aid after the conflict?
No, I'm simply extrapolating and speculating. All I can point to are corruption indexes, which I think are important because that's a good indicator of the country's institutions. But no, I have no evidence of that. And more to the point, those indices are looking backwards. I'm guessing that has got no relationship to what Ukraine is like under Zelensky. That being said, cultures and institutions do not change overnight, and they simply should be kept in mind. Cultural change is slow. Cultural change is difficult. Culture is important.
Henry, unless I missed it when I was looking ahead to new questions, we have two questions asking which government is paying for the operation of the trains?
Germany. Of our trains, Germany.
Okay. Okay, from Scott Sigmund, primary agricultural commodity markets have been disrupted globally by the constraints on Ukrainian production and exports. Do you have any insights into the war's impact on freight car types and the differentiated movements, e.g. passenger with heavy past peak use you've described? I think he's just trying to get into the state of the operations there to help move agricultural goods.
Okay, so let me answer the question first. Do I have any insights? None whatsoever. Do I have any opinions? Well, what I'm guessing is that all of the covered hoppers of Ukrainian wheat that would have gone to the Black Sea ports are now being redirected toward places like the Polish border, where they're probably trying to transload them into covered hoppers from Western Europe. And there's all kinds of issues involved in trying to shift something as massive as an agricultural flow on short notice. And I'm sure that there is some limited success going on, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say it's probably really, really complicated. And that's probably going to be a good Sandhouse case study about a year from now.
Henry, Ryan Nemmerhoff asks, he presumes there are no tickets or fees to the refugees. It's purely a humanitarian effort. Has there been any coordination with Poland getting passengers out? And his follow-up question was also, can you confirm only women and children who have been the primary refugee groups?
Okay, so that was a long question. Let me work backwards. My anecdotal evidence of riding on the train is it's been mostly women and children because the men have stayed to fight, or the men have gone with their families to the West and then gone back to fight. And women have gone back to fight also. As far as, has it been a humanitarian effort? Yes, it's been an enormous humanitarian effort financed by the Polish government and the German government and other governments. So if you are coming from Ukraine and you find yourself on one of our trains, where do you go from the resettlement center in Hanover once our train takes you there and you sort yourself out? Answer, show them your Ukrainian passport. And you can go anywhere in Germany for free on any train.
You mentioned that the operations are going to cease soon. So Brooke Bentz asks, why is this the last train? Are there no more refugees coming west?
There are not enough refugees to justify the service. When you're down to a couple busloads worth of people, my understanding is that is why our service is not prolonged. We are all standing by, and that may change. But the government is coordinating everything, and we are a cog in that wheel.
Emmanuel Horowitz asks if you can tell us a little bit about the massive UZ passenger rail intra-Ukraine refugee movements from the eastern regions to the relative safety of Western Ukraine, such as Lviv.
For the most part, the essential services are running in corridors like Kyiv to Lvov and Odessa and places like that. So if you go back and look at that map, the central and western part of the country is still functioning. From what I've taken from some of the many news accounts and videos and stuff like that, is that they're running a basic service and that it's being fairly well used. But the point is, if you want to get from A to B, there is probably a train, as long as it's not in the middle of the conflict zone, and they're running at lower speeds because if the train is attacked, you don't want to have an incident at a high speed. You want to have it at a low speed when people have a reasonable chance of not being hurt in a derailment or whatever. The other interesting thing, by the way, is they're, on the overnight trains, they got all the shades down, lights are off, minimize your likelihood of being a target. But from most of the accounts that I've seen, there are people traveling not only from the east to the west, but actually the west to the east to go back home, or farther east to fight.
Carl Van Dyke asks, is there any chance UZ would start to re-gauge the railroad after this experience?
None whatsoever. And this is recorded. Let me rephrase it. Henry thinks that it's almost a 0% chance that they would re-gauge the network, because when the conflict ends, the rail traffic will want to move in the most efficient way, which is to the nearest body of water, which is to the Black Sea. And there will continue to be trade around the 1520 network. And I dare say it, once the conflict is over, there will probably be interchange of traffic with Russia, regardless of how the conflict winds up.
Craig Knox would like to know if you have any knowledge of the status of the transit lines in Kyiv.
Last time I rode the transit lines in Kyiv was in 2013, and still a lot of PCCs running around. And I would expect that they're probably dealing with it just like the railways, which are, if there's a problem, then you deal with it. And even for a tram network, I'm guessing that because of the nature of it, it probably would not be that difficult to put stuff back together. And I'm just guessing on that one because I'm not a transit guy. But the ability of rail transit to move masses of people is very important. And I'm guessing that they've got that one figured out.
Jeffrey Moeller asks, he said, aside from damage by military activity, are you aware if the rail network is being attacked by other means, such as cyber attacks?
I haven't heard of anything.
Dan Baer asks about, he said, the electrified power supply being a military target in case of a distribution, and in the case of distribution system destruction, how much redundancy is there using diesel locomotives versus electric, to your knowledge?
Well, that's a good question. And if you look at some of the news accounts, you see trains that you would expect to be hauled by electrics being hauled by diesels. But I saw a news report this morning about how the Kyiv to Lviv service was clearly being operated with electrics. So I'm guessing that they're able to keep at least some of the electrification going, if not all of it, in the non-conflict areas.
As a follow-up to the gauge question you already addressed, Dan Bear wonders if you see the installation of dual gauge on selected corridors to facilitate trade with the EU in the future.
No. Oh, sorry. I mean, as long as you've got a break of gauge, you're going to have to transload someplace. So you're stuck with that. It's not going to go away. You are not going to see. Sorry, again, this is recorded. Sorry about that. You are probably not going to see gauge conversion in Ukraine. It's just not practical.
Bob Moore asks, he asks if you have understand who is transporting military materials through Germany and Poland to Ukraine.
No. And even if I did know, I probably would not be allowed to say that.
Good answer. John Decker asked, he said the area where the most intense military action is now is also the area where the most dense part of the UZ network is located. Again, speculation on your part, but is that likely to survive such a hostile environment?
Railways are fairly easy to repair. And Soviet practice has been to have redundancy and replacement bridges, et cetera, all in place. One thing I forgot to mention, by the way, is you won't see a lot of double track bridges. What you want to have is a bunch, if you got a double track line, have two single track bridges. So if you lose one, you've still got the other. I would expect that regardless of the outcome, that the railways will be quick to be back on their feet.
Steve Dittmar wants to know if you've ever, and I'm going to struggle on the name, so you'll probably know what I'm talking about. Did you ever visit the huge locomotive factory in Luhansk? It made all the high horsepower diesel locomotives for the Soviet Union. And he comments that the factory was privatized and abandoned a few years ago.
No. I have builder's plates from our Soviet diesels from Estonia, and I could go over and check and see where they were constructed. But no, I have not been to any locomotive factories anywhere in the former Soviet Union.
Carl Van Dyke asks, what is the future for your German charter train business as we emerge from the pandemic? A little bit slightly off topic question, but relevant to you.
That's a very good question. So what we were left with was, after the Flix relationship ended, was trains and people. And so we redeployed them into, for example, services that we've launched ourselves, which is an overnight train from Austria to the island of Zilt, as well as becoming a provider of overnight rolling stock to state railways like Swiss railways and Swedish railways. And so we provided the sleeping cars, couchettes, and I think maybe even some sitters, but at least sleeping cars and couchettes for the new Swiss night train service from Zurich to Amsterdam. And then this summer, we will also be providing the rolling stock for the Swedish service from Stockholm to Hamburg. So it's an interesting story because as the state railways were getting rid of their night train equipment, we bought a lot because we knew we could use them as sitters, and we thought maybe something will happen in the night train market where somehow they might find higher uses in that market. And in this particular case, that's exactly what happened. Many of the state railways that got rid of night trains are putting them back. We can thank, among other people, Greta Thunberg for that.
So Henry, we don't have any more refugee related questions coming in. I have one more about operations in Malawi. It is from Herbert Haran, and he asks, can you give a quick update on the status of the railways in Malawi? Are the routes to the waterfront in Mozambique serviceable? Is there access to Zimbabwe?
The railway in Malawi is a landlocked system. And to the best of my knowledge, the line to the port of Beira in central Mozambique is still not open. I might be wrong about that. And that's the way to Zimbabwe. So that's a good question. I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that one. I do know the Kala line is functioning. It was completely rebuilt right before the coal business went into the tank. So it was another case, better lucky than good. And we made some money there and we dodged a bullet on that one.
Okay, one more question here for you, Henry, from Gerald Kelly, who asked, he says, the railroad in Ukraine seems to be a freedom route and not a military target as far as the news that he has seen. Is this a correct assessment?
There are reports of at least several stations being attacked with fatalities. I have seen photos of suburban trains that riddled with bullets. So there are attacks on railway stations that have happened. There are some attacks on trains, at least trains sitting in stations that I'm aware of. But beyond that, I can't answer that question other than what I have caught bits and pieces of in the news.
Norm, those are our questions for the day, so I'd like to hand it back over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Brett, and Henry, thank you very, very much for an extraordinarily interesting program. With regard to your record on police escorts of a trolley bus, we've not heard any response to contradict what you said. So I think you hold that record. And I wish to inform you that today you set a new record. We've had the highest attendance ever for a Sandhouse meeting with your presentation today. The previous highest, just so you know, was we had a presentation on the CN's acquisition of the EJ&E before it was approved by the Surface Transportation Board. So congratulations on the two records that at least we know of that you hold.
Well, thank you very much. That is appreciated. I'm guessing that the EJ&E presentation is probably tilted in the favor of residents of Barrington, but that's a different story for a different day. What I would like to do is remind people that on our website, rrdc.com, in the news section, there's a page, what you can do, and it gives our list of things that you can do to support Ukraine through the conflict. And there's other stuff on there as well. Once you're there, you might find other things of interest. But again, Norm, I'm honored to be here in Sandhouse. And again, I'm honored to have listed the Center for Railway Photography and Art as among the people who helped put this presentation together on very short notice.
Well, I know Scott is listening because he is Scott Lothus, our executive director and president, is listening because he texted me, and I believe also we had some of the staff members from the center as well. And I believe Bond French, our chairman, was also planning to attend, who is also a trustee of Northwestern University. So, and I want to say hello to my friend Justin Zubrod and John Plant, and thank them as well as everybody else for attending today. We will announce future meetings. We have a couple of interesting thoughts that Brett and I are working on. But again, Henry, thank you so much for today. And with that, our meeting is adjourned.
Thanks.
Thank you, Henry.
Slava Ukraini.